Emily. The voice was soft, a whisper carried on the wind, weaving through the gnarled branches and rustling leaves. Emily stopped at the edge of the woods, shivering as the cold air bit at her skin. The old house loomed at the end of the path, dark and menacing, its windows like empty eyes. "Emily, come closer." Emily took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Goosebumps erupted on her arms as the chill of fear crept up her spine. She knew what people said about this house, about Black Hollow, the stories of ghosts and lost souls. "You're scared, Emily, don't be." Her heart pounded harder, fear tightening its grip around her. But she had to be brave for Rachel. Determination flickered in her eyes. "I'm here, Rachel," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" Beside her, Greg shuffled his feet nervously, glancing around the darkening forest. "Maybe we should go, Em. It's getting late." Emily ignored him, her focus unwavering. She had to find her sister no matter the cost. The house was a rotting corpse against the dying light. Its windows were vacant eyes staring out at them. The porch sagged, threatening to collapse in on itself. "This place is creepy," Greg whispered, his voice tight with fear. "They say it's cursed." Emily knew the stories, everyone in town did. The house on Black Hollow Lane, where people went missing, where whispers haunted your dreams. "Rachel's here, Greg," Emily said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. "I can feel it." She took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked ominously beneath her weight. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and evil. Emily reached for the doorknob, its cold metal sending a shiver up her arm. It turned with a groan, revealing darkness within. Greg's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "I don't like this, Emily," Greg muttered, his voice shaking. "We should leave." "No, we need to find Rachel," Emily replied, her voice steady but her heart pounding. They moved deeper into the house, the flickering lights casting long, sinister shadows. Cobwebs brushed against their faces, adding to the growing sense of dread. A door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar, an eerie light seeping through the crack. Emily pushed it open, the creak echoing through the silent house. Inside, the room was dark, an old, dusty chair, the only piece of furniture. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was where Rachel had last been seen. The house swallowed them whole. The air inside was thick and still, heavy with the weight of secrets. Dust motes danced in the weak rays of sunlight that pierced the boarded-up windows. "Rachel?" Emily called out, her voice echoing in the silence. Only the creaking of the house answered her. Greg shivered. "This place is giving me the creeps." Emily ignored him. She could feel a presence here, a darkness that clung to the walls like cobwebs, and she knew somehow that it was connected to Rachel. A low growl echoed from the depths of the house, sending chills down Emily's spine. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out to touch the cold, damp wall. Emily's eyes caught an old photograph, half hidden under debris. It was Rachel. Why would Rachel come here? Emily's mind raced with questions. Faint whispers seemed to drift through the air, almost imperceptible. Emily felt eyes on her, watching her every move. She steeled herself, determined to find Rachel no matter what. Gap 3S. The world outside the house was a stark contrast to the nightmare they had just escaped. The fresh air felt like a lifeline, but the darkness they had encountered still clung to Emily and Greg like an unwanted shadow. The sun was setting, casting long, ominous shadows across the landscape. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She glanced back one last time at the house, now a crumbled ruin swallowed by the earth. "We need to keep moving," Greg urged, his voice trembling. He was right, they couldn't stay here, not with the darkness still lingering. They stumbled through the overgrown path, the forest around them whispering secrets of its own. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent shivers down their spines. They emerged into a clearing, the remnants of an old barn standing like a silent sentinel. Emily's legs gave out and she collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face. Greg knelt beside her, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's over," he said softly, but Emily shook her head. "It's not over, not until we understand what happened to Rachel." The barn door creaked open, revealing a dusty interior bathed in the last light of the setting sun. They moved inside, seeking shelter from the encroaching night. As they huddled together, the weight of their ordeal settled over them like a heavy blanket. Emily clutched her sister's locket, the only thing she had left of Rachel. "We'll find the answers," she whispered, more to herself than to Greg. "We have to." The night was long and filled with uneasy dreams. Faces of the past, whispers of the darkness, and the haunting image of Rachel's cold, glowing eyes. When dawn finally broke, it brought with it a fragile sense of hope. They had survived the night, but the journey ahead was uncertain. Emily and Greg knew that the darkness they had encountered was far from defeated. It was out there, waiting, and they would be ready. Together, they would face the shadows and uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Gap 3S. As they stepped out into the morning light, a solitary crow cawed overhead, a chilling reminder of the darkness they had escaped. But Emily felt a spark of determination ignite within her. They had survived the house on Black Hollow Lane. Now it was time to face whatever came next. As they ventured deeper into the forest, a dark figure emerged from the shadows, a sinister presence that sent chills down their spines. Emily stepped forward, confronting the ghostly figure that had once been her sister, Rachel. Greg stood by her side, holding a protective stance as they faced the darkness together. Emily held up the locket, which began to glow with an ethereal light, pushing back the shadows. The dark figure recoiled, the shadows retreating as the light grew stronger. With a shout of determination, Emily broke through the darkness, the light from the locket banishing the sinister presence. Emily and Greg embraced, a sense of relief and victory washing over them. As dawn broke over the forest, the light pierced through the trees, signaling the end of their ordeal. They walked out of the forest, determined to move forward and uncover the truth behind Rachel's fate. Together they were ready to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The house led them on a twisted path, through dark corridors and dusty rooms, each one colder, emptier than the last, until finally they reached a room at the end of a long, winding hallway. The door creaked open, revealing a sight that made Emily's blood run cold. Rachel stood in the center of the room, bathed in an ethereal white light. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and laughter, now glowed with an eerie, cold fire. "Rachel," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, "what's happened to you?" Rachel smiled, but it didn't reach her cold, empty eyes. "This house," she said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "It offered me a way out, a way to escape." Behind her, a dark shape coalesced from the shadows, a writhing mass of darkness and whispers. It reached for Rachel, its touch possessive and cold. Emily understood then. The house hadn't taken Rachel. Rachel had chosen this, chosen the darkness. Greg grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her back. "We have to go." Emily let him lead her away. The image of her sister's cold, glowing eyes burned into her mind. The house groaned around them, the floorboards buckling and twisting. They didn't look back as the house collapsed in on itself, swallowed by a swirling vortex of darkness and dust. The only sound that remained was the mocking caw of crows circling overhead, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked within the heart of Black Hollow. Emily and Greg stumbled out of the collapsing house, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The mocking caws of the crows grew louder, circling above them like harbingers of doom. Emily clutched Greg's arm, her eyes darting around the desolate landscape of Black Hollow. Suddenly the sky darkened and the crows descended, forming a swirling vortex of feathers and shadows. From within the mass, a figure emerged, an old woman, her eyes as dark as the night, her presence commanding. She was the keeper of Black Hollow, the soul who had watched over the cursed land for centuries. "You have trespassed where few dare to tread," the keeper intoned, her voice a haunting melody. "But now you stand at the crossroads of fate." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, her voice trembling yet defiant. The keeper raised a bony finger, pointing to the heart of Black Hollow. "The darkness must be contained. The house has claimed many, but it craves more. You must choose. Sacrifice yourself to seal the darkness, or let it consume the world beyond." Greg's grip tightened on Emily's hand. "There has to be another way," he pleaded, desperation in his voice. The keeper shook her head slowly. "There is no other way. One must stay, or the darkness will spread." Emily's mind raced. The image of Rachel, consumed by the darkness, flashed before her eyes. She couldn't let that happen to anyone else. She turned to Greg, tears streaming down her face. "I have to do this," she whispered. "No, Emily, please," Greg begged, his voice breaking. But Emily stepped forward, resolute. The keeper's eyes glinted with a cold, approving light. "You have chosen wisely." As Emily approached the swirling mass of crows, the darkness reached out to embrace her. She closed her eyes, feeling its cold tendrils wrap around her. The last thing she heard was Greg's anguished cry. The sky cleared, the crows dispersing into the ether. Black Hollow was silent once more, its darkness contained. Greg fell to his knees, the weight of loss heavy on his shoulders, but he knew Emily's sacrifice had saved them all. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Greg stood, determined to honor Emily's memory. The darkness of Black Hollow was sealed, but its secrets remained, waiting for the next soul brave enough to uncover them. As the first rays of dawn kissed the horizon, Greg rose from the ground, his heart heavy with grief and resolve. The chilling silence of Black Hollow seemed almost peaceful, but he knew better. The land was merely resting, waiting for its next victim. Determined to honor Emily's sacrifice, Greg began to walk away from the cursed house, his steps echoing in the still air. But something felt off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as a cold breeze whispered through the trees. Greg turned, his eyes scanning the shadows. He saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Ignoring the growing dread, he pressed on, eager to leave Black Hollow behind. As he reached the edge of the property, a low, mournful wail pierced the silence. Greg froze, his breath hitching. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a haunting melody that tugged at his very soul. He turned back, his eyes wide with fear. There in the distance he saw her, Emily, or what looked like Emily. She stood at the edge of the forest, her form shrouded in a ghostly mist. Her eyes, once full of life, were now hollow and empty. "Greg," she called, her voice an eerie echo. "Help me." Greg's heart pounded in his chest. "Emily?" he whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. But as he approached, the figure began to dissolve, her features distorting into a grotesque mimicry of his lost love. The wail grew louder, more desperate, and Greg realized with horror that it wasn't Emily at all. It was something else, something far more sinister. He turned and ran, the cries of despair following him like a shadow. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering secrets he couldn't understand. Greg's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop, he couldn't stop. The darkness of Black Hollow was alive, and it was hunting him. Finally, he burst through the tree line, collapsing onto the grass of a nearby field. The sun had fully risen, casting a warm glow over the landscape, but Greg knew that the horrors of Black Hollow were far from over. The darkness had been contained, but its echoes would forever haunt those who dared to tread its cursed grounds. As he lay there gasping for breath, Greg made a silent vow. He would not let Emily's sacrifice be in vain. He would find a way to end the curse of Black Hollow once and for all, even if it meant facing the darkness again. And so, with the sun rising behind him, Greg stood and walked away, the echoes of despair fading into the distance. But deep within the heart of Black Hollow, the darkness stirred, waiting for the next brave soul to uncover its secrets. Gap 3S. Exhausted but resolute, Greg continued his journey away from Black Hollow. The morning sun offered little comfort as shadows seemed to cling to him, whispering secrets he couldn't quite grasp. Each step felt heavy, as if the darkness was trying to pull him back into its clutches. Gap 2S. As Greg crossed the field, he noticed a peculiar silence. The usual sounds of nature were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. He paused, scanning the horizon for any signs of life. Suddenly a faint rustling reached his ears. Greg turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement in the tall grass. Gap 2S. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure, barely visible in the morning mist. It moved with unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. Greg's heart pounded as he realized it was heading straight towards him. He took a cautious step back, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. Gap 2S. The figure drew closer, and Greg could make out its features. A young woman, her face obscured by a tangle of dark hair. Her eyes, like Emily's, were hollow and lifeless. She reached out a hand, her fingers long and skeletal. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo of the plea he had heard before. Gap 2S. Greg's breath hitched as he recognized her. It was Sarah, a girl from the nearby village who had disappeared years ago. The villagers had whispered about her vanishing, blaming it on the curse of Black Hollow, and now she stood before him, a ghostly remnant of her former self. Gap 2S. "Sarah?" Greg whispered, his voice trembling. "Is it really you?" Gap 2S. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow. "The darkness. It took me. It wants you too, Greg." Gap 2S. Before he could respond, Sarah's form began to dissolve, her features warping into a grotesque mask of agony. The grass around her withered and died, leaving a circle of barren earth. Greg stumbled back, his mind racing. The darkness wasn't just confined to Black Hollow, it was spreading. Gap 2S. Determined to escape, Greg turned and ran, his feet pounding against the ground. The landscape around him seemed to shift and change, the once familiar fields transforming into a twisted maze of shadows. He could hear the whispers growing louder, their voices merging into a cacophony of despair. Gap 2S. Just as he thought he would be swallowed by the darkness, Greg burst through the tree line and found himself standing on the edge of a cliff. Below, a churning abyss of blackness stretched out, its depths unfathomable. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging him to jump. Gap 2S. Greg took a step back, his resolve hardening. He would not succumb to the darkness. He had to find a way to end the curse, to save the souls trapped within its grasp. But first, he needed to escape. Gap 2S. Summoning all his strength, Greg turned and sprinted along the edge of the cliff, his eyes scanning for any sign of safety. In the distance, he saw a small cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. Hope surged within him, and he pushed himself harder, the whispers fading into the background. Gap 2S. As he reached the cabin, Greg collapsed against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He glanced back at the abyss, its darkness swirling ominously. He knew that this was only the beginning. The curse of Black Hollow was far more insidious than he had imagined, and it would take all his strength and courage to uncover its secrets and put an end to its reign of terror. Gap 2S. With a deep breath, Greg pushed open the door and stepped inside, ready to face whatever horrors awaited him. The battle had only just begun, and the darkness would not be vanquished easily. But Greg was determined to fight, to honor Emily's sacrifice and save the souls trapped in the whispering abyss. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. Inside the cabin, the warmth was a stark contrast to the chilling darkness outside. Greg's eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing old, dusty furniture and walls lined with bookshelves. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and something faintly metallic. He moved cautiously, his heart still racing from his escape. Gap 2S. As he explored, Greg found a journal lying open on a table. The pages were filled with frantic scrawls and cryptic symbols. It belonged to someone named Elias, who had also sought refuge from the darkness. The journal detailed Elias's descent into madness as he tried to uncover the secrets of the curse. Gap 2S. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Greg's breath hitched as the temperature plummeted and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Gap 2S. "You cannot escape," the voices chanted in unison, sending chills down Greg's spine. He spun around, searching for an exit, but the cabin seemed to warp and stretch, trapping him within its confines. Gap 2S. A figure emerged from the darkness, its presence suffocating. It was Elias, or rather what remained of him. His eyes were hollow and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "The darkness is eternal, Greg. You cannot defeat it. You can only join it." Gap 2S. Greg's resolve wavered, but he clenched his fists, refusing to give in. "I will end this curse," he declared, his voice trembling but determined. Gap 2S. Elias's laughter echoed through the cabin, a sound devoid of any humanity. "Then face the darkness and let it consume you." Gap 2S. The cabin walls began to dissolve, revealing a swirling vortex of shadows. Greg felt an invisible force pulling him towards it, the whispers growing louder, more desperate. He fought against it, his muscles straining, but the pull was too strong. Gap 2S. As he was dragged into the vortex, Greg saw visions of Emily, Sarah, and countless others who had fallen victim to the curse. Their faces were etched with sorrow and pain, their eyes pleading for release. Gap 2S. No! Greg screamed, tears streaming down his face. He reached out, grabbing hold of a beam, his fingers digging into the wood. The darkness clawed at him, trying to pull him into its depths. Gap 2S. In a final, desperate act, Greg pulled the journal from his pocket and hurled it into the vortex. The pages caught fire, the flames spreading rapidly. The darkness recoiled, its grip weakening as the fire consumed the journal. Gap 2S. With a surge of strength, Greg pulled himself free and stumbled out of the vortex. The cabin was ablaze, the flames devouring the darkness. The whispers turned to screams and the shadows writhed in agony. Gap 2S. Greg collapsed on the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. He watched as the cabin was engulfed in flames, the darkness vanishing into the inferno. The curse was breaking, the souls trapped within finally finding peace. Gap 2. As the fire died down, Greg felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had done it. He had ended the curse. But the cost had been high. He had lost friends, loved ones, and a part of himself. Gap 2S. With a heavy heart, Greg rose to his feet and walked away from the smoldering ruins. The sun was rising, casting a warm, golden light over the land. The darkness was gone, but its scars would remain. Gap 2S. Greg knew that his journey was far from over. He would carry the memory of those lost with him, a reminder of the darkness that once consumed Black Hollow. But he also carried hope, a hope that the light would prevail and that the whispers of despair would never return. Gap 2S, Gap 2S. If you enjoyed this tale, please like and subscribe for more stories. Gap 3S.